Come in, my friend, close the door behind you the way you always do, and let the rest of the day fall away from your shoulders like something you're finally allowed to set down. Dim the light, if you haven't already. Pull the blanket up over you, not just across your legs, but up to your chin, the way you did when you were small and someone else used to do it for you. Let your body go heavy. You don't have to do anything else tonight except lie here and listen. I want to tell you something before we begin, and I want to tell you slowly, because it deserves that. Here is a fact that I think about more than almost any other fact I have ever learned, and I have learned a great many facts in my life. In the year 1870, in an ordinary middle-class household in England, a woman might spend between 2 and 4 hours of her morning, not her whole day, her morning alone, engaged in labor that left no physical trace by noon. No object produced, no wage paid, no entry in any ledger anywhere with her name beside it. And yet if she failed to perform that labor, if she got it wrong even once in a way, the neighbors could see the consequences would ripple through her household, her husband's reputation, her children's prospects, and her own sense of herself as a woman doing her duty for weeks, sometimes longer, 2 to 4 hours, every morning of her whole life. And almost none of it had a name. That is the shape of what we are going to spend tonight inside of, my friend. Not a battle, not a parliament, not a king. A morning, one ordinary morning, made of 1,000 small motions, most of which have vanished so completely from the record that most people alive today would tell you, if you asked them, that Victorian women didn't really do anything before lunch. They will tell you this with total confidence. They are wrong, and I want to spend tonight showing you exactly how wrong and exactly what was actually happening instead. In the kitchens, in the bedrooms, in the strange geography of stays and pins and coal dust and cold water and the arithmetic that women did in their heads before most of them had ever been taught long division. I promise you this, the version of Victorian mornings you are about to hear is more honest than the one you've absorbed from novels and films, and it is also, I think, more remarkable. Not because it was harder than you've been told, though in some ways it was, but because it required a kind of competence that we have almost entirely lost the vocabulary to describe. We call it getting dressed. We call it doing the washing. We call it keeping house. Every one of those phrases is a small act of erasure, a flattening of skilled labor into something that sounds like it happens by itself. So let us go somewhere specific. Let us not stay in the abstract, because the abstract is where all the erasing happens. It is somewhere in the middle of the 1870s. The exact town doesn't quite matter. It could be a market town in the English Midlands, the kind with a church spire visible from every street, and a river that floods a little every spring and embarrasses everyone by getting into the cellars. Let's say it's early October. The light at this hour, just before 6 in the morning, has a particular quality that photography never quite captures. A kind of gray-blue thinness, not dark exactly, but not yet trustworthy either. The light of a world still deciding whether it's going to commit to the day. There is a smell in the air that belongs specifically to this hour and this century. Coal smoke just beginning to rise from 100 chimneys at once, damp stone-wet leaves starting to rot sweetly in the gutters. And underneath all of it, very faint, the mineral smell of well water drawn up in the cold. Somewhere in a house on a street we will never need to name, a woman is waking up. Before we go further, where are you tonight, my friend? I always wonder this. Are you somewhere warm, with rain outside, or somewhere quiet and clear where you can almost hear the season changing? And what time is it for you right now, as you're listening? I like to imagine it. Some of you just finishing your day, some of you already deep into the night. All of you scattered across so many different clocks, all of us meeting here anyway. In this one particular October morning, 150 years gone. Settle in. Let's stay with her for a while. Let's call her Margaret. It's a good common name for the era. Solid, unremarkable, the kind of name that would not have made anyone glance twice at a christening register in 1841, which is roughly when she would have been born, making her 34 years old on this particular October morning. Margaret Whitfield, though she was born Margaret Hale, and there is a version of her life, there is a version of every woman's life in this century, that lives entirely in the space between those two names. She is 34. She has been married for 11 years to a man named Thomas Whitfield, who works as a clerk for a firm that handles the accounts of several local wool merchants. Respectable work. Steady work. The kind that placed the Whitfields firmly and permanently in the anxious middle of things, neither poor enough to be pitied nor rich enough to stop calculating. They have 3 children: Henry, who is 10 and already at the local grammar school; Alice, who is 7, and a third child, a boy named William, who is 2, and who Margaret still thinks of in the private language she uses only inside her own head as the baby. Though he stopped being a baby in any practical sense about 8 months ago. They keep one servant. Her name is Sarah. She is 19 and she sleeps in a narrow room at the top of the house under the eaves, where the ceiling is so low that she can only stand fully upright in the exact center of the room. This detail matters more than it sounds like it should, and we will come back to it because the presence of exactly one servant, not none, not several, placed the household in one of the most specific and least understood positions in the entire Victorian social structure. We'll sit with that later. For now, just hold it. One servant, 19 years old, already awake before Margaret, already working. Margaret's hands, if you looked at them closely, and almost no one ever did, because looking closely at a woman's hands was not really a thing one did in this century, unless you were about to marry her, would tell you almost everything you needed to know about her life. They are not soft. There is a permanent redness across the knuckles that never fully fades, even in summer, the result of years of contact with lye soap and cold water. There is a small hard callus on the side of her right middle finger, from a needle worn against the same spot for over 2 decades, since she first learned plain sewing at the age of 9. Her nails are kept short and functional, not out of any aesthetic preference, but because long nails simply did not survive contact with dough, coal scuttles, and the tight lacing of small children's boots. If you held her hand next to the hand of a woman who employed 6 or 7 servants, and therefore never touched raw meat, coal, or laundry starch, you would be able to tell them apart in the dark, by touch alone. Class, in this century, lived first and most permanently in the hands. Margaret wakes at 10 minutes to 6 without an alarm, because 11 years of the same schedule has installed a clock inside her body more reliable than any mechanism Thomas keeps on the mantel downstairs. The house is cold. It is always cold at this hour in October, because the fires banked the night before have burned down to almost nothing, and no fire has yet been laid in the bedroom. That will not happen until much later in the day, if it happens at all, outside the kitchen in the room where the family actually lives. Margaret's first conscious sensation most mornings is the specific and total cold of a Victorian bedroom just before dawn, the sheets warm where her body has been, the air above them sharp enough to make her want to stay under the blankets a moment longer than she allows herself. She does not allow herself long. This is the first thing worth pausing on, and I want us to actually pause on it rather than rushing past it the way most histories do. Getting out of that bed into that cold at that hour, every single day for years, was itself an act of will and discipline that we have almost no modern equivalent for. We complain, some of us, about getting out of bed into a house kept at 68 degrees by a thermostat we set from under the covers with our phones. Margaret got out of bed into air that might genuinely be near freezing, put her bare feet on a floor with no carpet in most of the room, and did this before anyone had thanked her for it, praised her for it, or even particularly noticed that she had done it. She did it because 11 years of practice had made the doing itself feel less like a choice and more like the shape of who she was. This is worth sitting with, because it is the first of many places tonight where discipline and identity become impossible to separate. She dresses first in what is called her wrapper, a loose, informal gown, unboned, meant only for these very early hours before the real work of dressing begins. Underneath it she is already wearing her chemise, the simple linen undergarment she slept in because a respectable woman of Margaret's station did not sleep entirely without a layer between her body and the sheets. Not for reasons of modesty exactly, but for reasons of practicality. Linen could be washed easily and frequently in a way that would have been impossible for anything more elaborate. And a woman's skin needed something between it and whatever she was lying on night after night, in a world without the kind of easy, frequent bathing we take entirely for granted now. I want to pause here on something that surprises almost everyone the first time they learn it, because it runs so hard against the picture most of us carry of the Victorian woman as endlessly obsessively clean. All lavender water and spotless linen. The The truth is more interesting and more forgiving. Full bathing, actual immersion, actual washing of the entire body happened, for a woman in Margaret's position, perhaps once a week, sometimes less in the colder months. It was not laziness, and it was not a lower standard of cleanliness than we imagine. It was arithmetic. Hot water in a house like the Whitfields did not arrive from a tap. It arrived because someone, usually Sarah, sometimes Margaret herself, heated it kettle by kettle over the kitchen fire, and then carried it heavy and dangerous up a flight of stairs to a hip bath that had to be filled, used, emptied, and dried by hand every single time. A full bath for one adult could require 40 or 50 gallons of water once you accounted for filling and rinsing, and each gallon weighed roughly 8.5 pounds. And every single one of those pounds had been drawn from a pump or a well heated over an open flame and carried, usually upstairs, by a human body. Do that arithmetic yourself, my friend, lying there in the dark. 40 gallons, 340 pounds of water, minimum, moved by hand to make one bath possible. Multiply it by a family of 5. Mine is the smallest child, who is still washed in a basin, and you begin to understand why weekly, rather than daily, was not a failure of hygiene but a triumph of practical logic. What happened daily instead was what the century called a sponge bath, or simply washing. Margaret standing at a washstand with a china basin and jug of cold water, sometimes warmed slightly, if Sarah had brought a small can up from the kitchen, working a cloth over her face, neck, underarms, and the more essential areas of her body briskly in cold October air before dressing further. This was not clamorous. It left her skin faintly reddened from the cold water and the friction. It was also, when you actually sit with it, an act of considerable stoicism performed silently every morning by essentially every woman of Margaret's class in the entire country, and almost never mentioned anywhere, because it was so completely unremarkable to the people doing it that it never occurred to anyone to write it down. This is the part that almost nobody talks about, not because it was secret, but because it was so ordinary that it was invisible even to the people living inside it. The historical record is full of the things Victorians found worth remarking on. Cold water on bare skin at 6 in the morning was not one of them. It simply was, the way weather simply is, and so it disappeared from the written record almost entirely, surviving mostly in household manuals that mention it only obliquely, in passing, the way you might mention breathing. Now we come to the part of Margaret's morning that most people, if they think about Victorian dress at all, think about first and understand least: the corset. I want to be careful here, because there are two equally wrong stories about the Victorian corset that circulate constantly, and neither one is true, and the truth sits in a more complicated and more interesting place between them. The first wrong story is the one you've probably absorbed from costume dramas: the corset as instrument of torture, women fainting constantly, ribs cracking, tight lacing as universal practice, a kind of ambient cruelty women submitted to, because men demanded it. The second wrong story, which has become fashionable more recently as a kind of overcorrection, is that the corset was actually comfortable, practical, even liberating, that all the horror stories are feminist myth-making, that Margaret would have felt about her corset roughly the way you feel about a supportive bra. Both of these are too simple. Let us actually look at what Margaret is doing, physically, right now in this cold bedroom, and let the complexity be complicated. Margaret's corset is not the extreme, tightly laced 18-inch waist fantasy of the costume drama. That level of tight lacing was a minority practice even among the fashionable, associated more with a particular aesthetic subculture and with younger, unmarried women pursuing a very specific silhouette than with the daily experience of a 34-year-old mother of 3 managing a household. Margaret's corset, made of catil, a tightly woven cotton twill, and stiffened with steel or whalebone busks, is doing something more mundane and, in its way, more genuinely useful to her. It is providing structural support for a body that has carried and delivered 3 children, that stands and bends and lifts for most of the day, and that has no other form of back support available to it in an era before the modern understanding of posture and core strength. Margaret laces it herself, standing before a small mirror, reaching behind her in a motion so practiced her hands barely need to look for the laces, though on days when Sarah is available, Sarah does it, pulling the laces snug, while Margaret holds the bedpost and exhales. Here is the honest complication, and I want you to hold both halves of it at once, the way Margaret herself must have, Without ever quite putting it into these words, the corset restricted her. It limited how far she could bend, compressed her internal organs to a degree that modern medicine would find genuinely concerning, and contributed over years to changes in muscle tone and even rib shape that we would now consider a real physical cost. This is true. And also true, without it Margaret's back, strained daily by lifting William, by bending over the kitchen table, by standing for hours at a stretch, would have hurt more not less because the corset was functioning, whether by original design or by long cultural accident, as a genuine and effective back brace for a body doing genuinely demanding physical labor. She did not experience it primarily as an instrument of male control. Though the fashion system that dictated its shape absolutely was shaped by ideas about how women's bodies should look that had everything to do with what men found desirable, and almost nothing to do with what women's bodies actually needed. Margaret experienced it most mornings the way you experience your own daily habits, as simply the shape her day took, uncomfortable in a low background, way she had stopped consciously registering around the 4th or 5th year of wearing one useful, in a way she also mostly didn't examine, because it had never occurred to her that there might be an alternative worth wanting. I do not say this to be harsh, and I do not say it to let the century entirely off the hook either. I say it because it is important to sit with the fact that a single garment can be simultaneously a genuine physical burden, a genuine physical support, and instrument of a beauty standard that served male preference, and simply Tuesday. All 4 of these things were true of Margaret's corset at 6:10 in the morning, and she was not confused about this the way we might expect her to be. She simply did not think about it very much at all, because thinking about it very much was a luxury that belonged to women with more time than she had. Over the corset comes the camise she's already wearing, then drawers. And here is a small detail I find myself thinking about often because it upends another common assumption. Split drawers, meaning 2 separate legs joined only at the waistband, open at the crotch, a design that seems strange to us now, but that made an enormous amount of practical sense in a world of complicated undergarments, limited bathroom facilities, and no convenient way to remove multiple layers quickly. Then a corset cover, a light garment to protect the corset from perspiration and protect the outer dress from the corset's boning. Then, and this depends entirely on the year and the fashion, because fashion moved with real speed even in this supposedly static century, either a crinoline if we were a decade earlier or by the mid-1870s. A bustle and a set of petticoats layered specifically to create the silhouette that magazines and neighbors alike would recognize as correct. I want to stay with the petticoats for a moment, because this is a good place for the zoom. Let's go from the broad fact of Victorian women wore many layers, down to one single specific petticoat, the one Margaret is now stepping into. It is made of a heavier cotton, quilted at the hem for warmth, and for the particular stiffness needed to support the skirts above it. It weighs, on its own, perhaps 1.5 pounds. She owns 3 petticoats in active rotation, 1 heavier for the cold months, 2 lighter for warmer weather, and the fabric for each one and the labor of cutting and sewing each one represented a real and calculated expense that she tracked mentally alongside every other expense in her household. Which brings us gently toward the part of this story that almost never gets told with any real specificity, and which I think matters more than almost anything else we'll discuss tonight: the money. Let us stay with this for a while, because I think it is the part that changes how you see everything else. Thomas Whitfield's salary as a clerk handling wool merchants' accounts was in the range of £130 to £150 a year in the mid-1870s, a real, if unspectacular, middle-class income. Enough to keep one servant, rent a modest but respectable house, and maintain what the century called appearances, which was a phrase, doing an enormous amount of quiet, exhausting work. Of that income Thomas would hand Margaret a portion, not the whole of it, and this distinction matters enormously, as a household allowance, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, to cover food, coal, candles, Sarah's wages, and the countless small expenses of running a home. The remainder Thomas managed himself: rent, his own clothing, insurance, savings, and whatever else he judged fell under his own domain rather than hers. Here is the arithmetic I want you to actually hold in your mind, because it is more concrete than most histories bother to make it. Sarah's wages as a general servant in a household of this size would run somewhere around £12 to £14 a year, plus her board. Her food and her narrow room under the eaves counted as part of her compensation. a common practice that meant a servant's cash wage looked smaller than her actual total value while also meaning she had almost no cash of her own with which to exercise any independence. Coal for the winter months might cost the household 2 or 3 pounds across the season. A length of good wool fabric sufficient for one dress, the kind Margaret would need replaced every few years as older dresses wore through or fell out of fashion in ways that mattered more than we tend to credit, might cost anywhere from 10 shillings to over a pound, depending on quality. And remember, there were 20 shillings to the pound. So we are talking about a fabric expense that could represent several days' worth of the entire household's food budget for one dress before a single hour of the labor to actually construct it was accounted for. And here is where the invisible labor becomes visible, if you know where to look. Margaret did not simply spend this allowance. She managed it, tracking in a small book kept in her own hand exactly what came in and what went out, adjusting week to week for the price of butter which fluctuated, for an unexpected expense when Alice needed new boots because her feet had grown, for the slow careful saving toward larger purchases months in advance. This was not casual. This was a real and demanding skill requiring arithmetic, foresight, negotiation with tradesmen who might try to shortchange a woman they assumed wouldn't check their sums, and a constant, almost professional grade balancing of competing needs against a fixed and non-negotiable total. A modern household budget run through an app that does the arithmetic automatically and flags overspending before it happens, asks almost nothing of the person managing it by comparison. Margaret's budget asked for mental arithmetic performed daily, memory for dozens of ongoing prices and debts, and judgment calls with real consequences, because if she miscalculated and ran short before the next allowance arrived, there was no overdraft. No credit card, only the humiliation of asking Thomas for money before he expected to give it, an act that in many households of this kind carried a real emotional cost. A small but real erosion of the fragile authority a woman held within her own domestic sphere. This is the key economic argument I want to leave sitting quietly beside you tonight, without hammering at it, because I don't think it needs hammering, only noticing. The labor Margaret performed managing this budget was skilled, professional-grade financial labor. It required exactly the kind of numeracy, foresight, and negotiation skill that, when performed by a man in an office, earned a salary, a title, and a line on a curriculum vitae. When performed by Margaret in her own kitchen with her own small book, it earned nothing that the world outside her four walls would recognize as earning at all. It was not called work. It was called being a good wife. The invisibility of that labor, not its difficulty, which everyone quietly understood, but its invisibility, its total absence from any ledger that mattered to anyone but her, was itself a kind of structural injustice, built so deeply into the architecture of the century that almost no one, including Margaret herself, had the vocabulary to name it as such. I don't say this to make Margaret into a symbol of oppression. She was not a symbol. She was a specific woman with a specific gift for arithmetic that the world around her simply never thought to value out loud. And I think that is sadder, in its quiet way, than any more dramatic injustice could have been. Let us come back to her body, because we left her half-dressed, and the morning is not going to wait for us any more than it waited for her. Over the petticoats now comes the dress itself, and here I want to slow down, because the putting on of a Victorian dress was not the simple act of stepping into a garment that we perform today. Margaret's day dress, not her best dress which is reserved for calls in church, but her ordinary everyday dress made of a durable wool and cotton blend in a dark, practical color that would not show dirt easily, fastens up the back with a long row of hooks and eyes, sometimes as many as 30 of them, running from the base of her spine to the nape of her neck. She cannot fasten this dress herself. Not entirely. She can manage the lower portion twisting and reaching, but the upper hooks between her shoulder blades are simply beyond the reach of her own arms. And this is not an accident of poor design. It is, whether anyone intended it this way or not, a structural fact that quietly bound women together, made a household with only one adult woman in it genuinely difficult to manage alone, and made Sarah's presence in this house about far more than cooking and cleaning. Sarah comes in now, having already been up for the better part of an hour herself, having already laid and lit the kitchen fire, and her fingers move up Margaret's back with the particular, unthinking speed of a task performed several times a day for over a year. I find myself thinking about this moment often when I imagine Margaret's mornings. Not the dress itself, but this small, wordless intimacy between two women of very different stations, standing close together in a cold bedroom just after dawn, one dressing, the other, neither one particularly noting the strangeness of it because it was not strange to them at all. It was simply how the day began. There is something worth pausing on here about the way the century organized women's bodies into networks of mutual, unequal, unspoken dependency. Margaret needing Sarah's hands to become presentable to the world. Sarah needing Margaret's household to remain fed and housed and paid it all. Both of them bound to a rhythm neither had entirely chosen, both of them in their very different ways. Extraordinarily competent at what the day required of them. Her hair comes next, and I want to give this the attention it deserves, because hair in this century was not a 5-minute affair, and the skill involved in doing it well was genuinely underestimated then, and is almost entirely forgotten now. Margaret's hair is long. She has never cut it because cutting a woman's hair short in this era carried associations she would never have wanted attached to herself, tied as they were to illness, to institutionalization, to a kind of visible unconventionality that a clerk's wife in a respectable market town could not afford. Uncut since girlhood, it likely falls well past her waist when fully loose, though almost no one outside her own bedroom and her own husband ever sees it that way. Brushing it alone thoroughly with a natural bristle brush, working from the ends up toward the scalp to avoid unnecessary breakage, takes a genuine stretch of minutes, not the quick pass we give our own hair now, but a slow, repetitive, almost meditative labor. 100 strokes being a commonly cited, if not universally practiced ideal, done partly for the health of the hair and scalp, which in an era without regular washing, needed the natural oils redistributed by brushing to stay manageable, and partly because it was simply believed correctly, as it happens, to keep the hair healthier over the kind of decades-long span in which a woman might never once cut it. Then comes the arrangement itself. Not the elaborate jeweled evening styles you might picture, but a practical daytime-style hair, divided, sectioned, and pinned up into a low knot or coil at the back of the head, requiring genuine three-dimensional spatial skill performed almost entirely by feel, since Margaret can see only the front of her own head in her small mirror, and must judge the back by touch and long practice alone. This is a skill, my friend. I want to say that plainly, because it has almost entirely vanished from how we describe Victorian women's daily lives. Margaret can, without looking, without assistance, most mornings construct a stable, secure, socially correct arrangement of several feet of hair using only pins, in under 15 minutes entirely by touch. If you tried to do this yourself tonight, you would fail, almost certainly, on your first dozen attempts. It took Margaret years to learn, beginning as a girl watching her own mother, and by 34 it has become so automatic that she does it while thinking about something else entirely. What to make for dinner, whether Henry's cough sounded better this morning, whether the cold would last the week. This is the pattern I want you to notice now, because it is going to recur again and again tonight in the kitchen, in the nursery, in the small ledger book. In every corner of this house, skill so total it has become invisible even to the person performing it. Margaret would never in 100 years have described herself as skilled at hairdressing. She would have said, if you'd asked her, that she simply did her hair, the way you might say you simply tie your shoes. But what she is actually doing every single morning is a genuine, learned, physically demanding craft. Spatial reasoning, fine motor control. Structural engineering performed with pins and hair pomade instead of steel and rivets, and the century had absolutely no word for this that would have granted it the status of a skill. It only had the word grooming, which sounds, when you say it now, almost like something you do to an animal. And I think that says more about the century's regard for this labor than any single sentence in any household manual ever could. By 6:30, Margaret is dressed, her hair is done, and she moves downstairs into a house that is by now beginning to wake around her, Henry's feet already audible above, thumping across the floor of the room he shares for now with William, before the household's finances allow for the separate room a 10-year-old boy is beginning quietly to want. Alice is still asleep or pretending to be, a small act of private negotiation with the morning that Margaret allows her within limits, because Alice is 7 and Margaret remembers distantly being 7 herself, though the memory has the strange, softened quality of something that happened to a different person entirely. The kitchen, when Margaret reaches it, is the one room in the house that has been properly warm since before she woke. Sarah's fire laid and lit before 6 has already brought real heat into the room. And this is worth pausing on, because the kitchen fire in a Victorian household was not simply a convenience. It was the entire mechanical and thermal center of daily life, the single source of hot water, cooked food, and warmth in a house that would otherwise have been genuinely, dangerously cold through much of the year. Laying and lighting it well, not too much kindling, wasted not so little that it failed to catch the flue drawing correctly. The coal arranged to burn steadily rather than either smoldering uselessly or burning through too fast was itself a skill that took real time to master, one that Sarah had learned in her previous position, before coming to the Whitfields from an older servant who had in turn learned it from someone before her. An unbroken chain of women teaching other women a specific, consequential competence that no school in England offered any formal instruction in whatsoever. The kitchen range itself, likely a cast-iron closed range, the kind that had become standard in middle-class homes by this decade, replacing the older open hearths that Margaret's own mother would have cooked over, is a genuinely complex piece of machinery by the standards of the century, with separate compartments for the fire and oven, a hot water reservoir called a boiler, and a hob surface for pots and kettles. All of it regulated by a series of dampers and flues that had to be adjusted by feel and experience to control the heat in each section independently. There was no dial, there was no thermostat. There was only Sarah's and increasingly Margaret's own learned sense of how the fire was drawing this morning, how the wind outside was affecting the flue, whether the bread in the oven needed the damper opened a little or closed a little, based on nothing more measurable than the smell beginning to reach the kitchen and a glance through the small glass panel on the oven door. I want to give you the weight of this range, because weight is one of the senses this story lives inside of most heavily, and it is one that modern life is almost entirely removed from us. A fully loaded coal scuttle, the kind Sarah has already carried up from the cellar once this morning and will carry up again before the day is through, weighs somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds. She will make this trip most days at least twice, sometimes 3 times up a narrow flight of stairs from the cellar to the kitchen. And this is before we count the water, because every kettle, every pot, every basin of water used in this house today for cooking, washing, tea, and later for laundry was drawn from a pump in the yard or in a house of this modest station, quite possibly still from a well, and carried by hand in buckets into the kitchen. Water is heavy in a way that is easy to say and hard to actually feel unless you've carried it. A single gallon weighs a little over 8 pounds. A full bucket of the kind used in this household might hold 2 gallons or more. Sarah and Margaret together will move conservatively somewhere in the range of 150 to 200 pounds of water through this kitchen before the day is even half over, not counting laundry days, when the figure climbs into a category that deserves and will receive its own separate telling on some other night. Because laundry in this century is a subject so enormous and so revealing that it cannot be done justice as a side note. This is Margaret's morning, my friend, not empty, not decorative, not the soft cushioned idleness that popular imagination sometimes assigns to women of her era, imagining them drifting from breakfast to embroidery to a nap, attended constantly by servants who did everything of any real substance. Margaret, with one servant, was doing an enormous quantity of the actual physical and managerial labor of her household herself, every single morning, and I think the reason this surprises people is precisely because it was designed, by the values of the century itself, never to look like labor at all. A woman managing her household well was not supposed to look like she was working. She was supposed to look, effortlessly, like a lady, and the effort required to produce that appearance of effortlessness was, itself, one of the most demanding and least acknowledged jobs of the entire century. Breakfast is being prepared now, not an elaborate meal in this household, not the multi-course spread you might picture from a wealthier home, but bread, already baked the day before or early the same morning depending on the week's rhythm, butter, tea, perhaps a little bacon if the week's budget has allowed for it, porridge for the children in the colder months because it was cheap, filling, and warmed a child's stomach before the walk to school in October air. Margaret moves between the kitchen and the small dining room that also serves most days as the family's general sitting room, setting the table herself, while Sarah manages the stove. The two of them moving around each other in the tight kitchen with the wordless choreography of people who have done this every day for well over a year. And here, I want to slow all the way down because this is the kind of moment the history books never think to include. And it is exactly the kind of moment I think matters most. Margaret pauses for perhaps 30 seconds at the kitchen window while the porridge finishes on the hob behind her. Outside, the October light has changed since she woke. The gray-blue thinness has given way to something warmer, a low autumn sun beginning to catch the wet slate roofs across the street, turning them briefly, silver. She is not thinking about anything in particular. She is not composing a great thought. She is simply standing still for 30 seconds in a morning that has already asked a great deal of her, and has a great deal more still to ask. And something in her, something that has no name in the vocabulary available to her, something we might now recognize as the simple, universal human need for a moment of stillness before the demands of a day close over your head completely, is taking this 30 seconds because it is in its own quiet way hers. This is the part I find myself thinking about most out of everything we've covered so far tonight. Not the corset, not the coal, the 30 seconds at the window, because it tells you something true that all the facts and figures, as important as they are, can't quite tell you on their own. That inside every one of these skilled, disciplined, endlessly demanding mornings, there is still a person, not a role, not a function, not a set of competencies performed on schedule, but Margaret herself specifically standing at a window in October light that she noticed, and that noticing mattered to her, even though she never once would have described it to herself or to anyone else as mattering at all. Let us stay in this house a while longer, because the morning is not finished with Margaret yet, and I don't want to rush past the rest of it the way most tellings do. Henry comes down first among the children already dressed in the plain, sturdy clothes appropriate for the grammar school, a jacket that was new 18 months ago and is now beginning almost imperceptibly to strain a little at the shoulders in a way Margaret has already noticed and already begun quietly budgeting for, because a growing 10-year-old boy is, among many other things, a recurring line item in a household ledger, one that arrives with no warning and very little mercy. He eats his porridge quickly the way boys of 10 eat most things, and Margaret watches him with an attention that looks to anyone glancing in from outside like simple maternal fondness, and is that certainly, but is also something more specific and more anxious than fondness alone. Here's a thing worth pausing on, because it touches something Margaret would never have said aloud to anyone, not even to Thomas, and probably not fully even to herself. Henry is in the arithmetic of this family's future, the entire investment. His schooling, modest as it is, represents a real and ongoing expense that the household absorbs specifically and only because he is a boy, because his education is understood by everyone in this house, and by everyone this house knows to be an investment in a future income that will eventually, if all goes as it is meant to, support not only himself, but potentially his parents in their old age and his sisters, in the event they are not otherwise provided for. Alice sitting at the corner of the same table, learning her letters not at any school but from Margaret herself in whatever 10 or 15 minutes can be found between the morning's other demands, receives no such investment, not because anyone in this house is deliberately cruel to her, but because the entire structure of value the century has built simply does not extend the same logic to a girl's education that it extends almost automatically, unquestioningly, to a boy's. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this into a simple story of villainy, and it is not that. Thomas is not a cruel man. He loves Alice, in his own, somewhat formal, somewhat distant Victorian father way, every bit as much as he loves Henry. He has simply never been asked by anything in his culture, his upbringing or his own experience to imagine that Alice's mind might be worth the same investment as Henry's, and so it has genuinely, honestly not occurred to him to imagine it. This is not the same as malice. It is something more patient and more complicated than malice. A whole society's worth of unexamined assumption expressed here in one small specific decision about where 18 shillings a term is going to go, made by a decent man who believes himself and is in most respects a fair one. Margaret teaches Alice her letters anyway, at the corner of the table in the gaps of the morning, using a slate and a primer that was Margaret's own as a girl, worn soft at the corners from 3 decades of handling. And here is a detail I find myself returning to, because it is the kind of small, private thing that never made it into any household manual or any letter that survived to be archived anywhere. Margaret teaches Alice not only her letters but quietly, without ever quite announcing that she is doing it. A little more than her letters. A little arithmetic, worked through with buttons on the table standing in for numbers. More than a girl of 7 strictly needed for any purpose the century had officially sanctioned for her. Margaret does this without ever framing it, even privately, as an act of defiance, because she does not experience it as defiance. She experiences it, if she experiences it as anything articulated at all, as simply wanting her daughter to be capable, a modest, almost unconscious extension of care that happens to run gently against the grain of everything her culture has told her a girl needs to know. This is one of the small acts of private deviation that fill the century, almost invisibly, never organized, never political in any way its participants would have recognized, and yet taken together across a million kitchen tables like this one, quietly shaping the next generation of women in ways no one at the time could have measured or named. William, meanwhile, is underfoot in the specific, chaotic, universal way of a 2-year-old in any century, pulling at Margaret's skirts, attempting to climb onto a kitchen chair, not bait for climbing, producing at intervals sounds of both delight and outrage that seem to arrive from entirely different children. Margaret manages him the way she manages everything else this morning, with a kind of practiced, half-conscious competence that never fully stops redirecting him from the fire with one hand while buttering Henry's second slice of bread with the other, her attention divided across 4 or 5 simultaneous tasks in a way that would exhaust a person trained for exactly one job at a time. This too is a skill, and I want to name it as one because the century never did. The capacity to hold multiple competing urgent demands in your attention simultaneously for hours at a stretch without visible strain is a genuine cognitive labor, one that modern workplaces would recognize instantly as a specific and valuable competence if it showed up on a resume, and that Margaret's world simply filed under the heading of being a mother, as though it required no particular ability at all. By 7:30 the children are fed. Henry has gone, satchel over his shoulder, out into the cold, bright morning toward the grammar school, and the house settles into the next phase of its rhythm, the phase that belonged in almost every household of the Whitfield station, to correspondence, to accounts, and to the quiet, essential social maintenance that kept a family's place in the world secure. Margaret sits for perhaps 20 minutes at a small writing desk in the corner of the sitting room, not an elaborate piece of furniture, but hers in the sense that mattered. A surface where her own handwriting, her own small decisions, could exist without immediate interruption. Here she keeps her household book, a slim cloth-bound volume in which every expense, however small, is recorded in a neat, careful hand. Not because anyone requires this of her, not because Thomas checks it, though he might occasionally glance through it with mild approval, but because Margaret has understood since the earliest days of her marriage that the household's financial stability rests in very large part on her own vigilance, and that vigilance without a written record is simply hope, wearing a more respectable coat. I want to give you a fuller sense of what this ledger actually contains, because the specificity is where the real story lives. Bread, so much a week, its price fluctuating slightly with the season and the harvest. Butter, a separate line, more expensive, watched more carefully, sometimes reduced in the leaner weeks, in favor of dripping the reserved fat from roasted meat. Saved and reused for cooking, in a habit of thrift so deeply ingrained in women of Margaret's generation that it would have felt less like sacrifice and more like simple common sense. Coal purchased, not daily, but in larger quantities when the price was favorable, requiring Margaret to track not only what she needed, but when the market for it was likely to be kinder to her budget. A kind of forecasting genuinely performed, with no formal economic training whatsoever. Learned entirely through years of trial, of getting it wrong occasionally in the early years of her marriage, and adjusting the way any competent professional learns a trade. Sarah's wages paid monthly, a fixed and non-negotiable line that Margaret protects fiercely in her own private calculations, because she understands, in a way she would never phrase quite this bluntly, even to herself, that Sarah's labor is the single mechanism that makes the rest of Margaret's own labor even remotely sustainable, and that any household desperate or foolish enough to let a servant go unpaid or badly paid was inviting a collapse of the entire fragile structure that kept a family like theirs looking respectable to the street outside. And then there's the matter of Margaret's own money. What the century, in a phrase that has not aged well and that I think deserves a moment of real scrutiny, called pin money. The term itself, by the 1870s, was already something of an anachronism, dating back to an earlier century when a wife's small personal allowance really was intended, literally, for pins and minor sewing notions. By Margaret's time, it had come to mean something a little broader. A small discretionary sum separate from the household budget proper that a woman might use for her own minor personal expenses, a length of ribbon, a subscription to a magazine, a small gift for a friend's child, the occasional modest indulgence that had nothing to do with keeping the household running and everything to do with Margaret existing in some small way, as a person with wants of her own. I want to sit with this term for a moment because the diminishment built into it is worth naming plainly. Pin money. Not wages, not income. Not even really, an allowance in the sense of something owed to her, a kind of leftover, a rounding error, a sum small and inconsequential enough that no one troubled to give it a more dignified name. Margaret's pin money in a household of the Whitfields' modest means might amount to only a shilling or two a week, if that, and every penny of it existed entirely at Thomas's discretion, subject to withdrawal or reduction if the household's fortunes change with no legal standing, no contractual guarantee, nothing but the ongoing goodwill of a husband who was by most accounts and by Margaret's own private estimation a reasonably good one. This is worth pausing on because reasonably good is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. Margaret's entire personal financial autonomy, her capacity to buy so much as a ribbon without asking permission in the moment, rested on the character of one man, a man she had chosen, yes, but a man whose legal and financial authority over her, under English law as it stood at this exact moment in the 1870s, was close to total. The Married Women's Property Act, which would begin to change some of this, had passed only a couple of years before this particular October morning in 1870, and its protections were in 1875 still partial, still contested, still barely beginning to reshape the deep legal architecture that had for generations before Margaret treated a married woman's property in almost every meaningful sense as her husband's. Both of these things are true, and I want you to hold them together rather than choosing one. Margaret was not, by the standards of her own time and place, unhappy in her marriage, and Margaret's legal and financial existence was by any honest modern accounting built on a foundation of dependency that could have been genuinely precarious had she married a different kind of man. This is not bitterness, and it would be dishonest of me to tell you Margaret experienced her own life primarily through the lens of injustice, because she did not. She experienced it, most days, through the much more immediate lens of coal prices and Henry's jacket, and whether William's cough was getting better. But the structure underneath her days was real, and it shaped every single decision within those days, whether she consciously registered it or not, and I think it does her memory no honor to pretend otherwise. There is a knock at the door, gentle, a little before 8. It is not a caller. No respectable caller would arrive at this hour, calling being an activity governed by its own elaborate, unspoken rules that dictated the correct time of day, almost as strictly as they dictated the correct card to leave and the correct number of minutes to stay. This is the milkman, a boy of perhaps 14 with a yoke across his shoulders and 2 heavy churns of milk that he ladles by measured scoopfuls into the jug Sarah brings to the door. Margaret does not go to the door herself for this. It is understood without ever needing to be discussed that answering the tradesman's calls belongs to Sarah's sphere of the household's operations, not because Margaret is above it exactly, but because the maintenance of small, precise social distinctions, like this one, was itself part of what kept a household legible to the street outside as a properly run, properly respectable one. I find myself thinking often about how much of this century's social order was maintained not through any single law or any single enforcer, but through exactly this kind of small, constant self-policing choreography. Who answers which door? Who is called Mrs. Whitfield, and who is called simply Sarah? Who eats in the dining room and who eats in the kitchen? Who is required to say please to whom? No one in this house has ever sat Sarah down and explained the rules to her in so many words. She learned them the way Margaret learned her hairdressing, the way a language is learned by a child immersed in it, by absorption, by correction when she got it wrong, by the accumulated weight of 1,000 small cues until the rules felt not like rules at all, but simply like the shape of the world. And here's the surveillance I promised we would come to, because it is inseparable from everything else this morning contains. The street outside the Whitfields' house is not empty. Curtains move occasionally in the houses opposite, and Margaret is aware of this the way you are aware of weather, not with constant anxious attention, but with the background knowledge that shapes her choices without her needing to consciously invoke it every time. If the milkman's boy is seen lingering too long at the Whitfields' door, Sarah is seen taking in a delivery in anything less than a properly tidy apron. If Margaret herself is glimpsed at an odd hour in anything resembling disarray, this will be noticed and noted and will circulate in the particular slow, deniable way that reputation circulated in a town small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, without anyone ever quite admitting to gossiping about it. This is the part I want to be honest about rather than sentimental about, because there is a real warmth in the kind of tight community Margaret lives inside, a warmth that meant, when Henry was ill with a fever 2 winters ago, 3 separate neighbors sent over broth and offered to sit with him so Margaret could sleep. A warmth that meant a woman in genuine crisis in this town was very rarely left entirely alone, and there is also inseparably a real cost to being constantly quietly watched, a cost that expressed itself not in any single dramatic incident, but in the 1,000 small self-corrections Margaret made everyday adjustments to her dress, her tone, her visible schedule, made not out of fear exactly, but out of a deep absorbed understanding that a woman's respectability once questioned was extraordinarily difficult to fully restore. I want to be careful here, because both of these things are true at once, and neither one cancels the other out. The community that would have rallied around Margaret in a crisis was the same community whose watchfulness constrained her, daily, in ways so constant she had largely stopped feeling them as constraint at all. By 8 o'clock, Thomas has come down dressed for his own day at the wool merchant's offices. A different kind of dressing than Margaret's, quicker, requiring no assistance. A plain dark suit that took him perhaps 10 minutes to put on entirely by himself. A fact so unremarkable to everyone in this house that no one has ever once commented on the asymmetry it represents. He eats his breakfast, reads a little of yesterday's newspaper, exchanges a few words with Margaret about the day ahead. Whether the coal merchant is expected, whether Henry's boots need looking at. A small domestic negotiation conducted in the unhurried, slightly formal tone of 2 people who like each other well enough and have long since stopped needing to perform affection loudly to know it is there. I find myself thinking about this exchange more than almost any other moment in Margaret's morning, because it is so easy to overlook and so revealing when you actually look at it. In the space of perhaps 4 minutes over tea, Thomas and Margaret conduct the entire formal business of running a household of 5 people, and every single item on that agenda, the boots, the coal, the children's various needs, belongs in practice entirely to Margaret to execute, while belonging in law and in nominal authority to Thomas to approve. This is the marriage as a kind of joint enterprise with a deeply uneven division of both labor and formal power, functioning most days smoothly enough that neither party experiences it as remarkable, because it is simply how every marriage they have ever observed has functioned, and imagining an alternative would have required imagining a different world entirely, which was not in October of 1875, a thing either of them had much occasion or encouragement to do. Thomas leaves for his office a little after 8, and the house, for a moment, exhales. Alice has gone to sit by the window with her primer, sounding out letters under her breath. William has been settled for the moment with a set of wooden blocks on the sitting-room floor, and Margaret finally sits down at her small desk again, not to manage money this time, but to write a letter to her own mother, who lives 2 towns away, and whom Margaret sees perhaps 4 or 5 times a year, and a shorter note to a friend, Mrs. Fenwick, confirming a call for the following Tuesday, phrased with exactly the correct degree of warmth and exactly the correct degree of formality that the century's elaborate rules of correspondence demanded. Rules so precise that an entire genre of etiquette manual existed solely to teach women exactly how many words of affection were appropriate between women of Margaret's specific degree of acquaintance. This, too, is a skill, and I want to name it plainly before we let this morning rest a little. Margaret's correspondence is not idle chatter. It is the maintenance of an entire social and, in its quiet way, economic network, because a woman's social standing, her circle of respectable friends and callers, was not simply a matter of pleasure but a real form of insurance, a web of relationships that could be called on in illness, in financial difficulty. In the countless small crises, a household this size was never more than a bad season away from. Every letter Margaret writes this morning is a small act of infrastructure maintenance performed in beautiful, careful copperplate handwriting that she was taught as a girl specifically for this purpose, among others, and that she now deploys with the same unconscious fluency she brings to her own hair. Sarah, meanwhile, has been moving through an entirely separate mourning of her own, in the same rooms, under the same roof. And I think it would be a real failure of honesty to tell you Margaret's mourning tonight without also giving Sarah a little of the attention she deserves, because Sarah's competence is in its own way every bit as considerable as Margaret's, and her constraints are, in most ways, considerably tighter. Sarah rose this morning at 5:30, a full 20 minutes before Margaret, and a room under the eaves so cold that she keeps a second blanket of her own purchasing folded at the foot of her narrow bed for the worst weeks of the winter. Her work today, before the family has even finished breakfast, has already included laying and lighting 3 fires, the kitchen range, the sitting room, and on the coldest mornings, a small one in Thomas's dressing room, blackleading the kitchen range's iron surfaces to keep them from rusting, a filthy, physically demanding task performed with a specific polish and a stiff brush that leaves her hands black to the wrist no matter how carefully she works, sweeping the front hall and the front step, because a dirty front step was one of the most visible, most quickly noticed failures a household could commit in the eyes of the street, and carrying, as we've already counted, a genuinely staggering weight of coal and water through the house before most of the family has even opened their eyes. Sarah's wages, as I mentioned, run somewhere near £12 to £14 a year, plus board, a sum that, set against Margaret's own effectively unpaid labor, tells you something important about how the century actually valued domestic work when it was forced occasionally to put a number on it at all. £12 a year is not nothing. It is a real wage, one Sarah is in fact slowly saving a portion of, kept in a small tin box in her room, toward a future she thinks about more than anyone in this house realizes, a future that might, if things go well, include a husband of her own choosing and a household of her own to run on terms that will, if she is fortunate, be at least a little more generous than the one she serves under now. But I want to be honest about what that wage actually buys the Whitfields, because it is, when you do the accounting, a genuinely enormous amount of skilled physical and managerial labor purchased for a sum that would not, by itself, have covered even a fraction of what it would cost in wages alone to replace Sarah's daily output with hired help, paid at any rate resembling fair value for the actual difficulty and skill of the work. This is the quiet arithmetic sitting underneath the entire structure of the Victorian household, and it applied with even more force, even more starkly to Sarah than it did to Margaret, because Sarah, unlike Margaret, was performing this labor not within the softened frame of wifely duty and eventual shared prosperity, but as a direct cash-for-labor transaction priced by a market that had decided, with a bluntness the household economics of marriage never had to fully confront, exactly how little this kind of skill was worth in pounds and shillings. I do not say this to make Sarah into a symbol either. She is not a tragic figure in her own mind most mornings. She is a 19-year-old girl who is good at her work, proud of the shine she gets on the kitchen range, mildly resentful of the cold in her room, fond of Alice in a way that surprises her sometimes with its intensity, and privately ambitious in ways that would astonish Margaret if Margaret ever thought to ask which. If I am honest with you, she rarely does not out of unkindness, but out of the simple, ordinary human failure of imagination that lets even a fundamentally decent person look at someone who serves them every day and see mostly the role rather than the whole person underneath it. There is one more thread I want to pull gently at before we let this part of the morning rest, because I think it changes how you hear everything else. Margaret's world in October of 1875 is standing in a very particular and very strange relationship to technology, not backward, not primitive, but genuinely actively transitional, full of things that were new enough to still feel a little miraculous, and other things that were just beginning to arrive and would, within a decade, quietly rearrange her daughter's entire life without Margaret ever quite realizing the rearranging was underway. The kitchen range itself, the one Sarah lit before 6 this morning, was itself a technology young enough that Margaret's own mother had cooked over an open hearth for most of her married life, only acquiring something like a range in her final years. Margaret grew up watching that transition happen, watching her mother learn well into middle age, an entirely new set of skills. The damper the flue, the closed oven, that had nothing in common with the open hearth cooking she'd practiced for decades before. I find myself thinking about this often, how much quiet, humbling relearning fell specifically on women in this century, asked again and again to master a new domestic technology in their 30s and 40s. Without any of the cultural permission we now extend to adults learning something new, without anyone framing it as impressive rather than simply expected. Sewing, too, sits at exactly this hinge point in Margaret's lifetime. She learned to sew entirely by hand as a girl, the callus on her finger the physical record of it, but sewing machines foot treadle operated had been available for purchase for over a decade by 1875. And a woman of slightly more means than Margaret in a household just one rung up the economic ladder might already own one, cutting the time required to construct a dress by more than half. Margaret does not yet own one. She has priced them £3 or £4 for a modest model, a genuinely significant sum against the household's budget, and has decided for now that the money is better spent elsewhere, a decision she reconsiders quietly, every few months weighing the hours it would save her against the coal it would cost her. And postal delivery, the letters Margaret wrote this morning to her mother and to Mrs. Benwick will travel within the next day along a nationwide postal network so fast, so cheap, and so reliable by the standards of any previous century that it has already begun to change in ways still unfolding. How far apart a family could live and still remain genuinely functionally connected. Margaret's own grandmother could not have maintained the relationship with a daughter 2 towns away that Margaret maintains with her mother today. Not because affection was different, but because the infrastructure to sustain it across distance simply hadn't existed yet. This is worth pausing on. Technology, in Margaret's life, is not a separate category of interest reserved for men and machinery. It runs directly through the center of her most intimate relationships. Her budget, her daily labor, reshaping the texture of her mornings in ways so gradual, she experiences them not as change but simply as the world continuing to be the world. We are going to stay in this house a good while longer tonight, my friend. There is a great deal more of this morning left. The arrival of the coal merchant and the particular arithmetic of buying fuel for a winter that has not yet fully arrived. The strange and specific etiquette of morning calls that will occupy Margaret's early afternoon. The long and quietly extraordinary subject of Victorian laundry, which deserves and will receive its own patient unfolding, and the moment still ahead of us. When this long, dense, invisible morning finally gives way to something like rest, it is a little past 9 now. The light outside has strengthened since we last checked it. That low, gold, particular October light, the kind that makes even wet slate roofs look, briefly, generous. Somewhere down the street, a cartwheel is creaking over cobbles. Let's go back inside, into the warmth Sarah built before dawn, and pick the morning back up exactly where we left it. The coal merchant arrives a little after 9, his cart heavy and dark and smelling of the particular mineral sharpness that coal carries, even before it's burned, a smell Margaret associates without ever articulating why with security. Because coal in the cellar meant warmth through whatever the winter decided to bring, and a household without enough of it by November was a household in real and visible distress, the kind of distress that neighbors noticed and quietly discussed. This transaction, small as it looks from the outside, a man with a cart, a few words exchanged at the door, coal carried down into the cellar by the merchant's own boy, is actually one of the more consequential financial decisions Margaret will make all season, and I want to slow down and show you why. Because the arithmetic here is genuinely interesting and genuinely demanding in a way that the phrase buying coal does no justice to at all. Coal prices in this era were not fixed. They moved with the season, rising as winter approached and demand climbed, sometimes moving quite sharply within the space of a few weeks, if a hard early cold snap sent every household in town to the merchant at once. A ton of coal delivered might run somewhere in the range of 18 to 25 shillings depending on the month, the quality, and the merchant's own honesty. And honesty was not something Margaret could simply assume. Coal merchants had across the century developed something of a reputation, fair or not, for shorting weight on deliveries to households where no one was paying close attention. and part of Margaret's job. Standing at the cellar door while the coal is unloaded is precisely to pay close attention, to have a rough practiced sense of what a ton actually looks like in her particular cellar, to know from experience roughly how many sacks a proper delivery should require, to ask, if the count looks short, in a tone polite enough to preserve the relationship, but firm enough to make clear she is not a woman who can be shorted twice. This is a genuine skill, and it is worth naming as one, a kind of applied embodied numeracy built entirely from repeated experience rather than any formal training, that let Margaret function as an effective auditor of her own fuel supply with no instrument beyond her own eyes and memory. Should she by now, at today's price, filling the cellar as full as the budget allows, gambling that prices will only rise from here as the season deepens? Or hold back a little, keep some of this month's allowance in reserve in case an unexpected expense arrives before the next allowance does, accepting the risk that coal might simply cost more by the time she's forced to buy again? There is no right answer, only a judgment call made with partial information under real constraint, with real consequences if she gets it wrong. Which is to say, it is exactly the kind of decision a purchasing manager or a household goods buyer would be paid a salary to make in any modern business, made here unpaid by a woman standing at a cellar door in a wool dress, holding a 2-year-old's hand, with her a free one, to keep him from wandering too close to the coal chute. I find myself thinking about this scene often, not because it's dramatic, but because it's the opposite of dramatic, and that's exactly the point. Nothing about this moment would have struck anyone watching it, including Margaret herself, as noteworthy. It was simply Tuesday, and that is precisely how a century managed to make an enormous quantity of skilled financial judgment completely invisible, not by hiding it, but by making it so ordinary, so woven into the unremarked fabric of a woman's day, that no one, not the merchant, not Thomas, not Margaret's own daughter watching from the window, ever thought to call it what it was. While the coal is being carried down, Sarah has already turned her attention to the midday meal. And I want to give this its own moment too, because food in this household is another entire hidden curriculum of skill and calculation that deserves more than a passing mention. The midday meal in a household like the Whitfields is the main meal of the day, dinner in the terminology of the period, eaten early enough that it can be prepared without gaslight, and substantial enough to carry the family through the afternoon with a lighter supper reserved for evening. Today, a modest joint of meat, not the best cut which the household's budget cannot regularly stretch to, but a cheaper, tougher piece that Margaret has learned over years to transform into something genuinely good through long, slow cooking and the careful practiced use of the range's lower, gentler heat. I want to pause on this, because it is another place where invisible skill hides inside a task the century simply called cooking. Margaret cannot afford, most weeks, the tender, expensive cuts that require little skill to render palatable. A good joint of prime beef needs almost nothing done to it beyond correct timing. What she can afford is the tougher, cheaper cuts full of connective tissue that will render a dish inedible if cooked quickly, and will become, if cooked slowly enough, patiently enough, with exactly the right amount of moisture and exactly the right lowered heat for exactly the right number of hours, genuinely tender and flavorful. This transformation is not accidental. It is a real, hard-won culinary skill. The kind that a professional chef today would be given real credit for, turning an inexpensive ingredient into something excellent through technique alone. And Margaret possesses it not because she trained for it in any formal sense, but because poverty, or at least the tight, ever-present financial constraint just above poverty, taught her over years of necessity exactly what a modern culinary school would take considerable tuition to teach a young chef today. Alongside the meat there are vegetables, potatoes, whatever the season allows, root vegetables, mostly this time of year cabbage, onions, bought that morning or the morning before from a market Margaret or Sarah walks to on foot, carrying everything back by hand, another quiet weight added to the day's accumulating physical toll. And there is bread, which in this household is baked at home, rather than purchased, a decision that represents its own small piece of household economics. Baking your own bread is cheaper than buying it from a baker, but it requires real skill, judging the dough's readiness by feel managing the unpredictable heat of a coal-fired oven with no thermostat, timing everything around the rest of the morning's other demands. And it requires time that a household with fewer hands to spare might simply not have. choosing instead to pay the baker's markup in exchange for buying back a portion of the morning. I want to stay for just a moment on the specific economics of meat because I think it is one of the clearest windows into how tightly calibrated this household spending actually was. A modest joint sufficient to feed a family of 5 stretched carefully across 2 days, today's dinner and tomorrow's, reheated or made into a pie with the remainder, might cost somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 shillings, a real and carefully considered expense against a household allowance that had to stretch across dozens of other needs in the same week. Margaret does not buy meat carelessly. She has a relationship cultivated over years with a particular butcher, one she trusts not to give her the poorest cuts at the price of better ones. A relationship built through the same kind of ongoing, patient social labor that maintains her friendship with Mrs. Fenwick. Small courtesies extended and returned, loyalty rewarded with slightly better treatment, an economy of trust running alongside the economy of coin. This is the comparison I find myself circling back to often when I think about Margaret's morning against a wealthier household's one with a cook of its own, a kitchen maid, a proper larder stocked without a second thought for the week's total spending. In that household, a woman of Margaret's social rank but greater means would never touch the meat, never negotiate with the butcher, never judge the doneness of a joint by anything but the word of a servant she trusted to know these things for her. Her mornings would be occupied instead with other, more purely social and decorative labors. Needlework meant for display rather than mending, letters of pure courtesy rather than urgent financial calculation, calls paid and received in a rhythm untouched by any need to also manage a household's actual survival. This is different from Margaret's morning in ways that are interesting to follow because it tells you something important. The popular image of the Victorian woman, idle and ornamental, waited on hand and foot, having nothing whatsoever to do. That image is real, but it belongs almost entirely to a narrow, wealthy slice of the century, a slice small enough that it should never have been allowed to stand in, the way it so often has in popular memory for the whole of what womanhood actually looked like in this era. Margaret, one modest rung down from that world, was doing something entirely different with her mornings, and so 1 or 2 further rungs down still was a woman with no servant at all, doing everything Margaret does, and everything Sarah does alone in a single body across a single day. A woman whose story deserves its own evening on its own night because it does not fit comfortably inside this one. Let us return for a few minutes to Alice before we move on, because I don't want her to disappear from this story the way girls her age so often disappeared from the actual written record of the century. In the early afternoon, while the joint finishes its long, slow cooking and before the light begins its October turn toward evening, Alice sits again at the corner of the kitchen table with her slate, and today she asks Margaret a question that Margaret has been asked before by Henry at roughly the same age, and answered differently each time depending on her own mood and the particular flavor of the day. Alice wants to know why Henry goes to school and she does not. I want to give you the honest shape of Margaret's answer, because I think it says as much about this century as anything else we've discussed tonight. Margaret does not tell her daughter that girls are less capable, because she does not believe this. Not really. Not underneath the layer of custom she has otherwise absorbed without question. She tells her instead something closer to the truth, as the century has handed it to her, that boys need schooling because boys will need to earn a living for a family one day. And girls need to learn different things, how to run a household well, how to sew, how to manage, because that is what a girl will need. It is not unkind, this answer. It is delivered with real warmth, and it is, within the logic Margaret has been given, entirely sensible. And yet, I want you to notice what is happening underneath it. Because Margaret herself does not quite have the vantage point to notice it, she is teaching her own daughter the very same account of value that has made Margaret's own morning invisible, passing forward gently, lovingly, without any malice at all, the exact framework that will make it just as hard for Alice one day to have her own labor recognized as anything more than simply what a woman does. This is not bitterness, and I don't want you to hear it that way. Margaret loves Alice completely, and Alice, though she doesn't fully understand her mother's answer, accepts it the way children accept most things, filing it away to be turned over again later, in some private moment years from now, that Margaret cannot yet see. But I think it is worth pausing on this exact quiet moment at the kitchen table. Because it shows you something the century rarely shows you directly, that the invisibility we've spent this whole evening tracing was not simply imposed on women from outside by husbands or laws or employers, though it certainly was that too. It was also passed, hand to hand, mother to daughter, in moments as tender and as ordinary as this one, by women who loved their daughters completely and had no other framework available to hand them instead. Alice returns to her letters after this unbothered, already distracted by the shape of a particular curling capital G that she's trying to get right, and Margaret returns to the meat. And the moment closes over as quietly as it opened the way. Most of the truly consequential moments in a life like this one always did. The rest of the late morning before the midday meal begins to occupy the household's attention. Belongs to something the century took extraordinarily seriously, and that most modern retellings treat as a kind of charming footnote, the etiquette of morning calls. I want to be honest with you about how strange this system looks from the outside. And also how genuinely functional it was, once you understand what it was actually built to do. A morning call, despite the name, did not happen in the morning in any sense we'd recognize. It happened by the rigid convention of the era sometime between roughly noon and 4 in the afternoon. The actual morning hours being reserved, as we've just spent an entire episode discovering, for the real labor of running a household. The naming itself tells you something about whose time this system was designed around. Morning in the etiquette book sense meant the hours before dinner, regardless of what the clock said, because the people who wrote the etiquette books were describing the leisured rhythm of women wealthy enough to have finished their obligations, or to have none by early afternoon. A rhythm Margaret, with one servant and 3 children, could only partially carefully approximate. Margaret's call on Mrs. Fenwick, confirmed by the note she wrote this morning, will happen this coming Tuesday, and I want to walk you through exactly what that visit will require of her, because the rules governing it are so specific, so widely understood without ever needing to be written down between the 2 women involved, that violating even one of them carried real social cost. She will arrive within a precise window, not so early as to seem overeager, not so late as to seem careless of Mrs. Fenwick's own schedule. She will bring calling cards, small, plain, engraved with her name, to be left with the servant at the door in the event Mrs. Fenwick is not in fact receiving that day. And the etiquette surrounding these cards was itself a small, elaborate language of its own. A corner turned down here meant one thing. A card left in person rather than sent by servant meant another. The precise number of cards left for a household with multiple female members carrying its own coded meaning that a woman was expected simply to know. The way you know not to interrupt someone mid-sentence without ever having been formally taught the rule in so many words. If Mrs. Fenwick is receiving the call itself, will last by strict and widely observed convention no longer than 15 to 20 minutes, long enough to exchange real warmth and real information, short enough that neither woman's actual working day is meaningfully disrupted. Margaret will not remove her outer things fully, a detail that always strikes me as quietly poignant when I really sit with it. A woman visiting another woman's home in her own town among people she has known for years, remaining in a small physical sense, ready to leave at any moment, a kind of built-in impermanence woven into even the most intimate of daytime social contact. And here is what I want you to understand about what this call is actually doing underneath its small, precise rituals. Because it is doing a great deal more than passing time pleasantly. This is where information moves. Which family is struggling, whose child is unwell and might need broth sent over, which servant left which household under what circumstances, and whether she'd be a safe hire, whose husband has had a run of bad luck at his firm, spoken about only obliquely in the careful coded half-sentences the century specialized in, but understood perfectly by both women all the same. This is Margaret's professional network, functioning with the genuine sophistication that a modern reader, primed to imagine these calls as empty social theater, tends to seriously underestimate. The 15 minutes at Mrs. Fenwick's house this coming Tuesday will do real, consequential work. Work that, should crisis strike the Whitfield household in some future month, will translate directly into who shows up with help and how fast. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make this sound purely transactional, purely strategic, because it wasn't only that. Margaret is genuinely fond of Mrs. Fenwick. They have known each other for 9 years, since shortly after Margaret's marriage brought her to this street, and there is real affection in the 15 minutes they'll spend together next Tuesday. Real laughter, real comfort taken in each other's company. Both of these things are true at once, the way they so often are in Margaret's life. The friendship is genuine, and the friendship is also functioning quietly as a piece of essential household infrastructure. And Margaret does not experience any contradiction in holding both truths at the same time, because nothing in her world has ever suggested to her that affection and utility need to be separate categories at all. I want to give you one more piece of this world before we move on, because it's easy to imagine the whole apparatus of calling cards and precise 15-minute visits as something purely rigid, purely cold, when in fact it functioned for women like Margaret as one of the only reliably sanctioned spaces in her entire week where she was permitted to simply talk, not manage, not instruct, not calculate, but sit across from another woman who understood, without needing a single word of explanation, exactly what her morning had contained. There is a particular kind of relief in being understood without having to explain yourself, and Margaret gets perhaps 15 minutes of it once or twice a week in Mrs. Fenwick's sitting room or her own, and I think it would be a mistake to underestimate how much those 15 minutes were doing for her. Quietly, beneath the surface of ribbon-trimmed cards and precisely observed departure times, it was in its narrow, heavily regulated way one of the only forms of peer support available to a woman in Margaret's position. No formal institution, no name for it. Nothing that would have appeared in any account of the century's social structures, and yet functioning for the women inside it as something close to what we would now recognize with a very different vocabulary as community care. Let us stay with the social world of this town a little longer, because there is a layer beneath even the calls and the cards that I think deserves real attention, the specific, unwritten, absolutely rigid rules governing what a respectable woman of Margaret's station could and could not do, wear, or spend money on, and the way those rules were enforced, not by any single authority, but by the simple, cumulative weight of everyone watching everyone else. A woman of Margaret's means could not, for instance, be seen shopping for certain items herself without some cost to her standing. Certain categories of purchase were understood to belong to servants or to husbands, and a woman doing them herself rather than sending Sarah signaled either an economy so tight it had become visible, which was itself a small social wound, or a carelessness about her own dignity that reflected, by the strange transitive logic of the era, on her husband's standing as much as her own. The clothing Margaret wears must be simultaneously fashionable enough to signal that the household is not struggling, and modest enough in cost and cut and ornament to avoid the opposite accusation, that the Whitfields were living beyond their actual means, spending money on Margaret's dress that a prudent family would have saved. This is an extraordinarily narrow needle to thread, and threading it correctly season after season, year after year, required Margaret to maintain a constant, sophisticated, largely unconscious social calculus, reading the dress of every woman she passed on the street, calibrating her own wardrobe, not against some fixed external standard, but against the constantly shifting, collectively negotiated sense of what was currently correct for a household exactly like hers. I find myself thinking about this constant calibration, often because it is one of the more exhausting, least visible forms of labor this century demanded of women, and it left almost no trace in any record anywhere. Because it never announced itself as labor, it looked from the outside like simple good taste. It was in fact a continuous, vigilant act of social navigation, performed every single day in every interaction, by a woman who had internalized her community standards so completely that she could no longer feel the effort of applying them, the way you no longer feel the effort of speaking your native language, until you try to explain its grammar to someone who didn't grow up inside it. And running underneath all of it, quiet and constant, was the surveillance we touched on last time. The neighbor's eyes, the curtains, the slow, deniable circulation of reputation through a town small enough that nothing truly stayed private. I want to be honest about the genuine cost of this, because it is real, and it is easy from the comfortable distance of a century and a half to romanticize the closeness of a community like Margaret's without sitting with what that closeness actually cost the people living inside it. A woman who stepped even slightly outside the accepted bounds, spent too visibly dressed too far above or below her station, was seen too often in the company of a man not her husband, even innocently, could find herself within a matter of weeks quietly and almost imperceptibly excluded. Fewer calls returned, fewer invitations extended, a coolness that no one would ever admit to, and that could not, therefore, ever be directly confronted or repaired. This is not a small thing. Social exclusion in a town like Margaret's was not merely unpleasant, it could have real economic consequences. Cutting a woman off from exactly the network of mutual aid and information that made her household stability possible in the first place. Both of these things are true, and I don't think either one cancels the other. The community was real, and its warmth was real, and its watchfulness was real, and its capacity for quiet cruelty toward anyone who stepped outside its lines was also entirely real. Margaret lived inside all of it simultaneously, the way we all live inside the contradictions of whatever world we're given, mostly without the luxury of stepping back far enough to see the whole shape of it at once. Let us step back for a moment, though, because I think it's worth doing what Margaret herself never had occasion to do, and looking at the wider picture her single mourning belongs to, because I don't think you can fully understand her without it. Margaret's grandmother, a generation and a half earlier, would have recognized almost everything about this mourning: the fire, the water carried by hand, the mending, the careful arithmetic of a tight household budget. But her grandmother's household and the households around it would also have contained a great deal more actual production happening under a woman's direction, spinning in some regions still within living memory at her grandmother's birth, brewing, more extensive home dairying, a whole economy of goods made, rather than bought, that had by Margaret's own lifetime been steadily and quietly drawn out of the home entirely, absorbed into factories and mills and the growing machinery of an industrializing economy. This matters because it changes what woman's work actually consisted of across the century in a way that's easy to miss if you only look at any single decade in isolation. The labor didn't simply stay the same while the world modernized around it. It shifted, losing some of its productive income-generating character as goods that used to be made at home became goods that were instead bought with money earned elsewhere, usually by a husband, and gaining in its place a more purely managerial and reproductive character. Not making the cloth, but managing its purchase, its cleaning, its repair, its transformation into a household that looked to the outside world properly and respectably maintained. I find this shift important to sit with because it helps explain something that might otherwise seem strange: why a century that was by many measures industrializing, rapidly building an economy increasingly organized around wages and markets and measurable output, simultaneously became more rigid, not less, about excluding women's domestic labor from that same economic accounting. As production moved out of the home and into the factory, the home itself became defined more and more sharply as the opposite of the economic sphere, a place of feeling rather than function, of morality rather than money. Even as the actual labor performed inside it, Margaret's labor remained every bit as demanding, skilled, and essential to the household's survival as it had ever been. The ideology hardened precisely as the economic reality it described was actually shifting underneath it. And Margaret inherited the hardened ideology, the sense that what she did all morning simply wasn't work in the way Thomas's clerking was work, without ever quite inheriting an accurate picture of how her own grandmother's era had understood these same questions rather differently. I want to be careful here, because I am not arguing that earlier centuries were somehow more just to women. They were not in most ways, and I would not want you to hear a note of nostalgia in this that doesn't belong there. What I am arguing is something more specific, that the particular flavor of invisibility Margaret lives inside, the specific sense that her morning's labor simply doesn't count as work in the way a bookkeeper's morning counts, is not some ancient, unchanging fact about womanhood across all of human history. It is a product of this particular moment, this particular economic transition, and understanding it as a product of specific historical forces, rather than as some eternal truth about the nature of women's lives, is itself a small act of restoring Margaret's labor to its proper place in history, not outside the economy, but at its very foundation, unpaid and unnamed, holding everything else up. Now, my friend, I want to turn to a subject I promised you last time, one that I think deserves more patience than almost anything else in this entire story, because it is, I genuinely believe, one of the most underestimated forms of labor in the whole of the 19th century, and because Margaret's own relationship to it, not on this particular Tuesday in October, but on the day that belongs specifically to it. Once a fortnight, sometimes weekly in households that could manage it, reveals something true about the whole century that nothing else quite does. I mean laundry. Let us zoom all the way in the way we did with the corset, the way we did with the hair, and look at a single wash day in this household. Because I think the specificity is the only thing that can actually convey what this labor really was. A wash day in the Whitfield household begins the night before, when the household's dirty linen, sheets, shirts, undergarments, the children's clothes, the kitchen cloths, everything accumulated over the preceding week or fortnight, is sorted. For the heaviest, most soiled items set to soak overnight in cold water, sometimes with a little soda added to loosen the dirt before the real work begins. Sarah and Margaret both know, without needing to discuss it, that wash day will consume nearly the entire day for both of them, from before dawn until well into the evening, and that almost nothing else of any real substance will get done in the house on this day, except the most urgent minimum of cooking and childcare. The morning of wash day, the copper, a large built-in metal vessel over its own small fire if the household is fortunate enough to have one, which the Whitfields in a house of this modest respectability is filled with water and brought to a full boil, and this alone represents a genuinely staggering quantity of labor before a single garment has actually been washed. Filling the copper might require 20 or more trips with a bucket from the pump in the yard, each bucket weighing, as we've already calculated, somewhere close to 20 pounds when full, carried across the yard into the scullery, and poured in again and again before the fire beneath it is even lit. Once the water is boiling, the actual washing begins, and it is worth understanding that this was not one single process but several, applied differently to different categories of fabric, each requiring its own judgment. The whitest linens, sheet shirts, undergarments, are boiled directly in the copper with soap, sometimes for as long as an hour, stirred periodically with a long wooden implement called a copper stick or dolly, to work the soap through the fabric and loosen ground in dirt, a task that requires standing over boiling water in a hot steam-filled scullery for the better part of that hour, breathing air thick with the sharp, slightly acrid smell of lye soap and wet wool and hot metal. Then comes the rinsing. Clean water, cold this time, in which the boiled items are worked by hand to remove the soap, often through 2 or 3 separate rinses to get the water running clear, each rinse requiring again buckets carried and emptied and carried again. Then the wringing done in this household by hand, twisting each heavy sodden garment between 2 sets of hands or against the edge of a tub with real physical force, because a garment not wrung sufficiently would take far longer to dry and risked mildew if the weather turned damp before it did. I want you to actually feel the weight of this for a moment, because weight is where this labor lives most honestly. A single wet bedsheet, fully soaked, can weigh 6 or 7 pounds, nearly triple its dry weight. A household wash of this size, across a fortnight's accumulation of sheet shirts, undergarments, and children's clothes, might represent in its fully saturated state before wringing somewhere in the range of 80 to 100 pounds of wet fabric that Margaret and Sarah between them will wring, lift, carry, and hang, piece by piece, entirely by hand, over the course of this single day. Delicate items. Margaret's better dresses, anything with color that might run or fabric too fine for boiling, receive an entirely different, gentler process, hand-washed separately in cooler water, worked carefully rather than boiled or beaten, because a mistake here could permanently ruin a garment that had cost real money and represented real labor to construct in the first place. This means Margaret cannot simply hand the entire wash over to Sarah and walk away. Her own judgment, her own knowledge of which fabrics can withstand which treatment is required personally throughout the day, because a servant working alone, however competent, could not be trusted in a household of this size, with sole responsibility for garments this valuable, without the risk of a mistake the family could ill afford. By early afternoon, if all has gone well, the washing itself is largely finished and the hanging begins. Every piece carried out to the small yard behind the house if the weather permits, or draped instead across wooden racks called clothes, horses, set up near whatever fire can be spared if the October weather has turned, as it so often does, uncertain. Hanging a wash this size, item by item, pinned or draped correctly to avoid stretching or misshaping the fabric as it dries, is itself another hour or more of standing reaching. Bending, physical labor stacked on top of physical labor in a day that offers almost no genuine rest between one demanding task and the next. And even this is not the end, because most of what has been washed today will need, once dry, to be ironed, a separate equally demanding labor that the household manages across the following day or two. Using flat irons heated directly on the kitchen range, tested for the correct temperature against a scrap of cloth, or in the older method Margaret's own mother used against the back of a moistened hand, because too hot an iron could scorch fine fabric in an instant, and too cool an iron would fail to press the fabric properly at all, requiring the whole tedious process to be repeated. I want to sit, for a moment, with what this day actually represents, because I think it is one of the clearest windows into the entire argument I've been making all night. Wash day required from Margaret and Sarah together an easy 12 to 14 hours of continuous physically brutal labor, heavy lifting exposure to scalding water and steam exposure to harsh lye soap that left skin cracked and raw, standing for hours on the stone scullery floor, combined simultaneously with real technical skill, knowing which fabrics could bear which treatment, judging water temperature by feel, timing every stage correctly to avoid ruining garments that represented real and difficult to replace household investment. If you describe this same set of tasks to a modern employer, 12 hours physically demanding, technically skilled, requiring sustained judgment under real financial stakes, they would understand immediately that they were describing a full and demanding job, one that deserved a wage, a title, protections. The century that Margaret lived in had a name for this instead, and the name was simply washing, delivered in the same flat, unremarkable tone you'd use to describe brushing your teeth, and it is precisely this flatness, this refusal to grant the labor its true weight in language, that I keep returning to tonight, because I think it is the quietest and most pervasive injustice of the entire era, not cruelty exactly, not deliberate exploitation in any single dramatic sense, but a whole civilization's worth of collective, unexamined agreement to simply not count this as work. I want to be careful here because I don't want to leave you with only the bleakness of that. There is real satisfaction in this too, and I don't think it is honest to leave it out. Margaret, by evening on a wash day, exhausted her hands, raw, would look at a yard full of clean drying linen, white against the gray October sky, moving very slightly in whatever breeze the day offered, and feel something genuinely close to pride. She had done this well. The sheets would be white, not gray. Nothing had been ruined. The household for another fortnight would smell of clean linen rather than the accumulated smell of a family living in close quarters, and that cleanliness, that order wrested by hand from cold water and boiling coppers and hours of standing, was hers specifically in a way that few other things in her day quite belonged to her alone. This is not bitterness, and it would misrepresent her to pretend she experienced wash day purely as oppression. It was brutal, and it was skilled, and it produced something she was genuinely proud of. And all three of these things were true on the very same Tuesday, in the very same tired body, at the very same time. I want to give you one more layer of this before we move on, because there is a piece of equipment sitting in the Whitfield scullery that I think deserves its own moment of attention. The mangle. By the 1870s, a household of Margaret's modest means might own or share with a neighbor a ringing mangle, two heavy wooden or rubber-coated rollers turned by a hand crank, through which wet fabric could be fed to press out water mechanically, rather than by hand twisting alone. This was genuinely new technology within living memory for a woman of Margaret's mother's generation, and it represented a real, if partial, easing of one of the most physically punishing parts of the wash day labor. And yet operating it safely and well was its own skill, feeding fabric evenly so it didn't bunch or tear against the rollers, judging the tension of the crank, knowing which fabrics could survive its pressure and which, like Margaret's finer things, needed to be wrung by hand regardless because the mangle would crush delicate weaves or damage buttons and trim. Even a genuine mechanical improvement, in other words, did not remove the need for judgment. It simply changed the shape the judgment had to take, and I think this is a pattern worth noticing, because it recurs across nearly every technological change this century produced. The labor rarely disappeared. It transformed, and the transformation nearly always demanded a new skill to replace the old one, learned once again, almost entirely by women, almost entirely without formal instruction, almost entirely unrecorded. Starching deserves a moment too, because it is the kind of detail that never survives into popular memory of the era, and that I think brings the whole picture into sharper focus. Collars, cuffs the fronts of Thomas's better shirts, certain of the children's clothes for church or for calls. All of these required after washing and before ironing a separate treatment with starch, mixed from powder and water to a precise consistency that Margaret judged entirely by eye and by feel. Too thin, and the stiffening effect would barely last the day. Too thick, and the fabric would crack and yellow with repeated wear. This too was knowledge passed from woman to woman, mother to daughter, mistress to servant, entirely outside any institution that might have called it a curriculum, and entirely essential to whether a household's public appearance. The crispness of a collar glimpsed across a shop counter or a church pew, read as respectable or as quietly worryingly slipping, and then a day or two later the ironing itself, which I mentioned briefly and want to give a little more room to now, because it is not the quick, incidental task it sounds like, when compressed into a single sentence. Margaret and Sarah work through the dried, starched wash piece by piece. The flat irons, solid lumps of shaped metal with no internal heat source of their own, reheated again and again on the range as each one cools. A rotation that requires at least 2 irons in use at all times, one heating while one works, timed so neither the ironing nor the reheating ever quite stops. Testing the heat against a scrap of cloth, or the older way, a moistened fingertip touched briefly to the iron surface, judging in an instant whether it will press cleanly or scorch. A full day's ironing for a household of 5 done properly. Collars crisp, pleats sharp. Nothing left with the telltale shine of an iron held too long in one place. Could occupy the better part of another entire day on top of the day the washing itself required. Meaning that a genuinely thorough fortnight's laundry start to finish consumes something close to 2 full working days of 2 women's combined labor roughly every 2 weeks for the entire duration of Margaret's married life. The evenings that fall between wash days belong to a quieter, but no less constant labor, mending. I want to give this its own moment, because it is easy, having spent so long on the drama of wash day, to let the smaller, steadier work disappear into the background the way it always has. Margaret sits most evenings after the children are down with a work basket at her side, needles thread of several weights and colors, a thimble worn smooth on its top from years of use, and whatever garment has that week announced itself as needing attention, a seam given way at Henry's elbow, a hem let down on one of Alice's dresses, the girl having grown again in the specific sudden way children do, seemingly overnight, a button replaced on one of Thomas's shirts, the original having vanished somewhere between the washing and the ironing, a small mystery Margaret has long since stopped bothering to solve and simply resolves instead with a spare kept, along with dozens of others sorted by size and color in a small tin on her work basket. This mending is not glamorous, and it rarely gets more than a passing mention in any history of the era, but I want to be honest with you about what it actually represented, the difference quite literally, between a household that could stretch its clothing budget across years, and a household that could not. Every hour Margaret spends with a needle in her hand repairing rather than replacing is an hour of skilled labor directly, measurably saving the family money that would otherwise have to come from somewhere else in an already tight budget, money for new fabric, or worse, money the household simply didn't have. I find myself thinking about this every time I picture her there in the lamplit sitting room, needle moving steadily, half her attention on the seam and half on whatever quiet thought is passing through her mind. Because it is such a perfect, compact example of the whole argument this evening has been making, a woman alone, unpaid, unremarked, performing genuinely skilled financial labor disguised entirely as something cozy and domestic and small. There is a further layer to this mending labor that I think deserves its own moment, because it is the kind of thing that sounds described plainly almost like a magic trick, and was in fact simply another quiet, demanding skill, the reworking of clothing entirely rather than simply its repair. One of Thomas's older shirts, too worn at the collar and cuffs to remain presentable for the office, but with plenty of sound fabric still in its body, might be taken apart entirely, the good fabric salvaged and refashioned over several evenings into something for William, a small shirt or a set of undergarments cut and stitched from cloth that had already lived one whole life as something else, a dress of Margaret's own fallen out of fashion, or simply worn past its best for public wear, might be unpicked at every seam the fabric turned to its less faded inside surface and reassembled into something wearable again, a practice the century called plainly turning, and which required Margaret to hold in her head the entire three-dimensional pattern of a garment she was simultaneously destroying and rebuilding, adjusting for a fabric, now more fragile than it had been when new. I want you to sit with the actual skill this required, because it is easy to let the phrase "she made over an old dress" slide past without registering what it actually demanded. This was pattern making without a pattern tailoring, without formal training performed on fabric that could not simply be replaced if a cut went wrong, by a woman who had learned it not in any school but by watching her own mother do the same thing on winter evenings 25 years earlier. It is in every meaningful sense the same category of skill a professional pattern maker or a costume designer would be credentialed and paid for today. And Margaret possessed it as simply one more unremarkable part of what a capable wife was expected to know how to do without pay, without title, without the faintest expectation that anyone would ever think to call it what it was. The afternoon after wash day, or after whatever the ordinary rhythm of a non-laundry day brings, folds gradually toward evening. And I want to move a little more quickly through these hours now, because the pace of this story, like the pace of Margaret's own day, is beginning gently to slow. The children are fed again a lighter meal in the early evening, and Henry returns from school with the particular loud, restless energy of a 10-year-old who has spent all day being still and quiet and now has a great deal of both physical and verbal momentum to release. A scraped knuckle from some small scuffle in the schoolyard that Margaret cleans and binds without much comment, because boys of 10 collect these small injuries the way other households collect dust. A story about a lesson that bored him, and another about a friend that delighted him, both delivered at nearly the same volume and with nearly the same urgency, in the specific way children have of treating every piece of news as equally important. Margaret listens to all of it while setting the table, her attention divided the way it has been divided all day, and something in her watching him talk with his mouth still half full of bread softens in a way that has nothing to do with duty or arithmetic or the invisible ledger of the day's labor, a plain, uncomplicated fondness that asks nothing of her except to be there listening for these few minutes before the evening's remaining small tasks reclaim her attention. Thomas returns not long after, and the house for an hour or two holds all 5 of them together, a rare specific configuration that will dissolve again within a few hours. Henry and Alice sent up to bed first, William not long after, until it is only Margaret and Thomas briefly in the quieter downstairs rooms, before Margaret too begins the last labor of her day, the banking of the fires, the final check of the locked doors. The small, closing rituals that fall as so much else has primarily to her. I find myself thinking now, near the end of this long day we've spent together, about something that runs underneath everything we've covered tonight, something I want to name plainly before we let Margaret finally sleep. Nearly everything we've discussed, the corset, the ledger, the hairdressing, the coal, the calls, the wash, required real, demonstrable skill. Not effort alone, though there was effort in abundance, but skill. Judgment developed over years. Technique refined through repetition, knowledge that had to be learned and could be learned well or badly. The way any genuine craft can be learned well or badly. And nearly none of it had a name that granted it this status. The century had endless words for what a woman was: dutiful, respectable, accomplished, a good manager, and almost no words for what she actually knew how to do, no vocabulary that would have let Margaret describe herself accurately. As a skilled financial administrator, a trained textile technician, a practiced logistics coordinator, a competent early childhood educator, because none of those categories existed yet in a form that could be applied to a woman working inside her own home. This is not bitterness, and I don't want it to land as bitterness. I say it because it is important to sit with the fact that the invisibility was not incidental. It was in its quiet way structural, built into the deepest architecture of how the century organized its language and its value, such that a whole enormous category of demanding, essential, genuinely skilled human labor simply had nowhere to register as such. Margaret was not a victim. That framing misses her completely, misses the pride she took in her clean laundry, the real competence she brought to her ledger, the genuine warmth of her friendship with Mrs. Prawn. Fenwick, the quiet, private rebellion of teaching her daughter a little more arithmetic than the world required. She was a whole, complicated, capable person, moving through a world that had simply never developed the words to see her clearly. And I think that is worth pausing on one more time before we let her go to sleep, not because it changes anything about the shape of her day, but because naming a thing correctly, even a century and a half after the fact, even for an audience of one person lying in the dark listening to a stranger's voice, still seems to me to matter. Evening has fully arrived now. The lamps are lit. Oil lamps in most rooms of a house like this one, their light warmer and less certain than gas, let alone the electric light that will not reach an ordinary household like the Whitfields for another 2 decades, yet casting soft-moving shadows across the sitting-room walls as Margaret finishes the last small tasks of her day. She checks that the children are settled, Henry already asleep, worn out by his own long day, Alice half asleep, murmuring something about her letters, William deeply, completely gone, the particular boneless sleep of a very small child. She and Thomas exchange a few last quiet words, the kind of unremarkable, comfortable exchange that closes 1,000 ordinary days and 1,000 ordinary marriages. And then Thomas too goes up. But before he does, and before we let Margaret climb her own staircase, I want to show you one more small thing because I think it matters more than its size suggests, and because it is exactly the kind of detail that the historical record almost never preserves, surviving mostly in the odd diary or the odd letter that happened by pure chance not to be thrown away. In the bottom drawer of Margaret's writing desk, beneath a folded shawl she rarely wears, there is a small plain notebook that is not the household ledger. It is not for Thomas's eyes, not because she has been told to hide it, not out of any deliberate secrecy exactly, but because it has simply never occurred to her that it would interest him, and because some very quiet, very private part of her prefers it that way. Inside it, in the same careful hand she uses for her correspondence, are notes, not a diary in any confessional sense, nothing about her feelings toward her marriage or her children set down in so many words, because that was not a form of writing this century particularly encouraged in women of her station, and Margaret would likely have felt a kind of embarrassment even attempting it. Instead, the notebook contains something else, passages copied out from a lending library book on botany that she borrowed quietly on a call to town 3 weeks ago, in a subject she has no practical use for whatsoever. No garden of any real size, no reason a household manual would ever give her to know the Latin names of common wild flowers. She copies a few lines most evenings after everyone else is asleep, by the light of the same lamp she's about to carry upstairs, and then closes the notebook and returns it to its drawer beneath the shawl. And this is the entirety of the ritual, and it means to her more than almost anything else in her day. I find myself thinking about this notebook often more than almost any other single detail in Margaret's life, because I think it tells you something true that the corset and the ledger and the coal cannot quite reach on their own. There is no rebellion here, not in any way Margaret herself would recognize as rebellion. She's not planning to leave her marriage, or petition for the vote, or do anything that this century would have registered as remarkable. She simply wanted for 20 minutes at the end of an exhausting day to think about something that was entirely uselessly, wonderfully her own, not chosen for its usefulness to Thomas or Henry or the household budget, but chosen only because the shape of a flower's petals and the strange, precise Latin word for it gave her a kind of pleasure that nothing else in her day quite offered. This is the small act of private deviation I promised you earlier tonight, and I think it is worth holding on to because it is easy telling a story, this dense with labor and constraint, to lose sight of the fact that the woman inside all of it was never only the sum of her duties. She was curious. She noticed things. She wanted in some private, unexamined corner of herself more than the world had thought to offer her, and she found a way in 20 quiet minutes with a borrowed book to have a small taste of it anyway, without ever once calling it anything as large as wanting. She closes the notebook now and returns it to its drawer, beneath the shawl exactly where it lives, but not quite yet. She sits a moment longer, alone in the lamp-lit sitting room, the house settling around her into the particular quiet of late evening, the fire in the grate burning low now, banked carefully for the night so it will hold enough of an ember to be coaxed back to life quickly in the morning. the small, ordinary sounds of an old house cooling and contracting after a day of heat, a floorboard somewhere upstairs, the wind picking up very slightly outside. She checks the front door is latched. She checks the kitchen where the range has already been banked by Sarah the coal scuttle, refilled for morning, everything set in careful readiness for a day that has not yet arrived, and that will begin again before 6. With Sarah's feet on the cold floor of the room under the eaves, and an hour or so after that with Margaret's own. Let us go up with her, briefly, past Margaret's own door, to that narrow room under the eaves, because Sarah's evening deserves a moment too before we let this house go dark. Sarah has been in bed for perhaps 20 minutes already by the time Margaret climbs the stairs. The small tin box she keeps her savings in tucked back under a loose floorboard she discovered in her first month here, and has told no one about, not out of any real fear that Margaret would take it, but simply because a thing that is entirely privately hers feels different, feels safer, kept a little apart from a household that otherwise sees and knows almost everything about her. She has added 4 pence to it this week, a little less than usual, because her mother in the next village over needed help with a debt, and Sarah sent what she could without a second thought. The way you help family, when you are 19, and still in some essential way, define yourself by what you can give, rather than by what you're owed. She is nearly asleep already in the specific total way that comes from a day of genuinely hard physical labor, and the last thing she thinks about most nights is not the blackleading or the coal or the 30 hooks she fastened down Margaret's back that morning, but the small private arithmetic of her own future. How many more years at this wage, saving what she can, before she might have enough for the household of her own, she thinks about more than anyone in the Whitfield house would ever guess. I find myself thinking about Sarah's tin box almost as often as I think about Margaret's notebook, because they are in their very different ways, the same gesture. 2 women in the same house on the same night, each keeping some small private thing apart from the world that otherwise claims nearly all of their waking hours. Neither of them would have called this defiance. Neither of them was trying to make any kind of statement. They were simply doing what people have always done, in every century, under every kind of constraint, finding some small corner of a demanding life that still, somehow, belonged only to them. Margaret, meanwhile, takes her own lamp and climbs the stairs past Sarah's door, and I want to leave her here, my friend, in this last quiet minute of her day, not doing anything remarkable, not thinking any grand thought, simply climbing a familiar staircase in the low gold light of an oil lamp, tired in the specific whole-body way that comes from a day genuinely well spent, toward a bed that will be cold when she first gets into it, and will slowly warm the way it always does around the shape of her. She sets the lamp on the small table beside the bed, and for a moment its light moves strangely across the ceiling, the particular flicker of an open flame rather than the steady glow we're used to now, throwing shadows that shift and settle as the wick catches a last, small draft from somewhere in the old house's frame. She unpins her hair, the same feat of spatial memory that assembled it that morning, now undone in reverse pin by pin, set carefully in a small dish on the table so none will be lost or trodden on in the dark, and it falls the full length of it down past her waist, the way almost no one but Thomas and her own reflection ever sees it. She unlaces what remains of the day's layers, slowly, her fingers moving with the particular deliberate slowness of someone whose hands have simply run out of the energy they had at 6 that morning. And then at last the lamp is turned down, the small flame drawn low, and then with one breath out entirely, and the room goes dark in the complete, textured way a room goes dark when there is no other light for miles beyond a handful of banked coals and a single distant street lamp. Here is what I find myself thinking about. Now, at the end of this long day we've spent inside together, we have spent a great many hours tonight inside one single ordinary October morning, and the day that followed it, a day with no battle in it, no great public event, nothing that any history book of the era thought worth recording. And yet I hope you feel as I do, that we have actually understood something true, something that 100 pages about parliaments and treaties could never quite give you, that an entire civilization ran every single day on a foundation of skilled, demanding essential labor performed almost entirely by women, and almost entirely without a name. The work that was called nothing was always something, Margaret's morning was not empty time before the real business of the day began. It was the real business, the load-bearing structure underneath everything else this household, and by extension this town, and by extension this century, was able to accomplish. And the distance between what she actually did and what the world around her was willing to call it, that gap, quiet and pervasive and built into the very grammar of daily life, was, I think, a form of injustice as real as any louder, more dramatic one, even though almost no one at the time, including Margaret herself, had the words to name it as such. I want to say something a little larger here, my friend, because I think it's worth reaching for, even at this late hour. We tend, when we imagine history, to imagine it as a sequence of decisions made by a small number of visible people. A monarch, a minister, a general, a reformer standing at a podium. And those decisions mattered, certainly. But underneath every single one of them, holding up the entire structure that made those decisions possible in the first place, was an almost unimaginable quantity of labor. Exactly like Margaret's. Millions of women across millions of ordinary mornings, keeping millions of households fed and clothed and functioning, none of it recorded, none of it counted, all of it simply assumed the way you assume the ground will hold your weight, without ever thinking to thank it. If you removed Margaret's labor and Sarah's labor and the labor of every woman like them for even a single week, the entire visible machinery of the century, the offices, the parliaments, the factories, the markets, would have ground to a halt within days. That is not a small thing to have been true, and it is not a small thing that it went almost entirely unspoken for so long. And here is the thing I keep returning to, the thing that makes this feel, to me, less like a closed chapter of the past, and more like a thread running directly into our own hands. Somewhere, right now, tonight, while you are lying there listening to me, someone is doing a version of this same invisible labor. Not with a corset, not with a copper full of boiling water, but with the same essential shape. The unpaid, unnamed, endlessly skilled work of holding a household together. Done so completely and so well that it disappears from view precisely because it is done well. The chain of hands did not end with Margaret. It runs forward generation after generation through women whose names we will never know, doing work that still, even now, struggles to find its proper name. Some of it looks different now. A laptop instead of a ledger, a washing machine instead of a copper. And some of it, if you look closely enough, has hardly changed its shape at all. The mental load of remembering everyone's needs before they're spoken. The quiet vigilance of a household budget. The small private thing kept in a drawer or a folder somewhere entirely one's own. I don't say this to leave you with only a lesson, exactly, because I don't think Margaret's story is really about a lesson at all. I say it because it is what I find myself thinking about lying here with you in the dark, having spent this whole evening with Margaret and Sarah and Alice and all the small, true, unrecorded details of one ordinary day. How much of what makes a life in any century is made of exactly this kind of unrecorded thing? Not the events that get written down, the corset laced in the cold, the 30 seconds at a window, the notebook under the shawl, the tin box under the floorboard, the small, steady, patient accumulation of competence that no one ever quite thought to call remarkable, performed by a woman who was, all along, exactly that. I think, too, about the fact that Margaret never knew she was being watched tonight, not by neighbors this time, but by us 150 years distant, choosing out of everything that happened in her century, to spend an entire evening inside her single, ordinary morning, rather than inside anything her own time considered important enough to record. There is something almost tender in that. I find something that feels less like historical curiosity and more like a kind of late, quiet justice. Not the loud kind, not a monument or a plaque, but the smaller kind. 150 years on someone finally sat still long enough to notice what her hands were actually doing, and thought it was worth the whole of an evening. I like to imagine, though I know it's only imagining, that some version of her would be glad of that, not because she ever wanted fame or recognition in any grand sense, but because every person in every century wants, in some quiet corner of themselves, simply to have been truly seen doing the things that filled their days. Before I let you go, my friend, I want to ask you something, the way I always do. Where were you tonight listening to all of this? What corner of the world, what particular quality of light or dark outside your own window? And what time is it for you now, as Margaret finally climbs her staircase and we come to the end of her day together? I love imagining all of you out there, in your own scattered hours, meeting me here inside the same October evening from 150 years ago. If you'd like to spend another evening like this one with me, I'd love to hear what world you want to visit next. Drop a comment and tell me. A different century, a different country, a different kind of ordinary life you've always wondered about. I read every single one, and the next video will be made from a suggestion left by someone watching right now tonight. Leave your idea below, and you might just hear your own name read out at the start of the next episode. And if tonight kept you company the way I hoped it would, please do like this video and consider subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps keep these evenings coming, and I'm so glad every time that you choose to spend part of your night here with me. We really do need your love and support to keep this going, but that is for tomorrow, or whenever you find your way back here. Right now there is nothing left to do at all. Sleep now, my friend. Let the last of the lamp go out, the way Margaret's has, somewhere behind us, in a room that has been dark and quiet for 150 years. Let sleep come. Rest well. Outside, if you could see it, outside that first October evening, the one we spent together tonight, there would be nothing left but a single street lamp at the end of the Whitfield Street, burning low and steady against the dark, and beyond it, a garden gone quiet, and beyond that, very faint, very far, the first stars of an ordinary October night, the same stars, more or less, that are somewhere above you too right now, wherever you are. Rest well, my friend. Sleep now.